The Zenith Collective had ruled the known galaxy for approximately 12,000 standard cycles, which was impressive until you realized they'd spent 11,000 of those cycles arguing about proper napkin folding techniques at diplomatic functions. They were, by all measurable standards, the pinnacle of civilization: 400 member species, 0 wars in 6 millennia, and a bureaucracy so complex it required 3-dimensional flowcharts just to file a noise complaint. They'd organized everything, categorized it, put it in neat little boxes with color-coded labels. Species were ranked on a scale of 1 to 10 for civilization quotient, which measured things like technological advancement, social harmony, and how well you could sit through a 4-hour opera without fidgeting. The Vren, with their crystalline cities and telepathic poetry, scored a solid 9.7. The Kalathi, master engineers who'd built a ring around their sun just because they could, pulled an impressive 9.3. Humans scored a 4.2, and that was being generous. The Collective had admitted humanity into their illustrious ranks with all the enthusiasm of a country club, accepting a member who showed up to the interview in muddy boots. Sure, humans had faster-than-light travel. Yes, they'd figured out quantum computing. But they also had something called mixed martial arts, 8 animals they'd specifically bred to be friendly with them, and their idea of conflict resolution occasionally involved throwing furniture. The Collective's xenoanthropologists had filed 17 reports, all essentially summarizing the same thing: humans were weird, potentially dangerous, and definitely didn't understand personal space. But the Collective prided itself on being inclusive, progressive, open-minded. Right up until one of those humans did something that offended their sensibilities, which happened roughly 3 weeks after first contact. The human in question stood in the center of the tribunal chamber, looking significantly less impressed than she should have been. The chamber itself was a masterpiece of intimidation architecture, a circular room 300 meters in diameter, with the accused standing in a spotlight at the center, while 12 judges loomed from elevated platforms arranged in a perfect circle. The ceiling displayed a holographic representation of the galaxy, slowly rotating, just in case you forgot how small and insignificant you were. She was short by human standards, maybe 1.65 meters, with dark hair pulled back in a practical knot, and the kind of compact, efficient build that came from actually using your body for things other than walking from hover transport to office chair. Her name was being translated through 17 linguistic matrices, but that hardly mattered now. The lead judge, a Vren whose crystalline body refracted light into judgmental rainbows, resonated with the tone of someone reading a parking violation for murder. You stand accused of acts of barbarism, unwarranted violence, and disrespect of sapient hierarchy. She raised an eyebrow. I punched a guy. You assaulted Ambassador Thexlon of the Not hierarchy. He grabbed my backside without permission. I applied proportional response. The tribunal rustled with shock. The Vren judge's light patterns flickered with indignation. Proportional? You broke his feeding appendage in 3 places. Could have been 4. She shrugged. I showed restraint. This was the problem with humans. The Collective had discovered. They had this bizarre concept called personal autonomy that they valued above proper social hierarchy. Ambassador Thexlon was a level 7 dignitary. She was a level 2 technician. The mathematics of proper behavior were clear. She should have filed a formal complaint, waited 6 to 8 months for committee review, and accepted whatever symbolic reprimand they deemed appropriate. Instead, she'd committed immediate personal violence. Barbaric. The Vren conferred with the other judges, a process involving light signals, harmonic resonances, and what appeared to be some kind of telepathic conference call. Finally, they reached a verdict, one delivered with the smug satisfaction of people who thought they were being remarkably merciful. The tribunal sentences you to exile on Kethara Prime for a period of no less than 5 standard cycles. She blinked. That's the Death World, the one you use for execution. We prefer involuntary conservation research posting, much more civilized. The Vren's lights pulsed with what might have been amusement. However, we are not unreasonable. You will be provided with standard survival gear. 1 environmental suit, 1 emergency beacon, and 7 days of nutritional supplements. How generous. We believe in giving all species a fair chance, the judge continued, which was hilarious considering everyone in the chamber knew exactly what Kethara Prime was. The collective had discovered the planet 40 cycles ago during a deep space survey. The science team had lasted 6 hours before activating their emergency extraction. The planet was a Class-XII Death World, gravity 1.3 standard, atmosphere breathable but humid enough to ferment your lungs, and an ecosystem that had apparently evolved under the principle that everything should be capable of killing everything else. The apex predators were called Rix'claw, 3-meter-tall packs of muscle, fang, and terrible attitude. They hunted in groups of 5 to 12, could smell prey from 3 kilometers away, and had never encountered something they couldn't eventually kill and eat. The collective had considered glassing the planet from orbit just on general principle, but that seemed excessive. Instead, they'd turned it into a penal colony for the most dangerous criminals. Murderers lasted a week, on average. War criminals managed maybe 3 days. One particularly notorious pirate lord had survived 18 days before his emergency beacon went silent. The human nodded slowly. When do I leave? Immediately. She smiled, and several judges leaned back slightly. Humans had too many teeth, and they showed them when expressing positive emotions, deeply unsettling. Well then, let's get this over with. Kethara Prime looked exactly like you'd expect a death world to look angry. The dropship descended through cloud layers that roiled with electrical storms, past mountain ranges with peaks sharp enough to perform surgery, and into valleys carpeted with vegetation that moved when there was no wind. The pilot, a nervous Kalathi with excellent self-preservation instincts, barely touched down long enough to shove the human out the cargo door along with her survival kit. She hit the ground running, or rather stumbling. 1.3 gravity was no joke. Every step felt like wearing a backpack full of rocks. The air tasted like a swamp had a baby with a greenhouse, thick enough to chew. The environmental suit helped, but the heads-up display was already throwing warnings about humidity levels, ambient toxins, and something called spore density that sounded deeply unpleasant. The dropship was already a speck in the sky. No goodbye, no good luck. Just the universal message: you're on your own, and we expect you to die quickly. She took stock of her situation with the kind of grim practicality that evolution had gifted humanity. The survival kit contained the promised supplies. 1 week of nutrition bars that tasted like cardboard had gotten philosophical about its existence, a basic med kit, a standard-issue plasma knife that might work if she was lucky, and an emergency beacon with a note that essentially said, "Activate this when you're ready to admit you're dying." The area around the drop zone was relatively clear, probably because the local wildlife had learned that screaming metal birds dropping from the sky meant incoming food that usually died within convenient eating distance. She could see the tree line about 50 meters away, massive things with trunks wide as buildings and leaves that seemed to track movement. Something howled in the distance. Then something else answered. Then what sounded like 6 more things joined the conversation, and the human decided that standing in the open broadcasting her presence was probably suboptimal for continued existence. The first night, she climbed a tree. Not one of the big ones. Those seemed likely to have their own ecosystems and possibly landlords, but a smaller specimen, only 15 meters tall. She wedged herself into a branch cluster, strapped in with her suit's safety line, and tried not to think about how every sound in the darkness below sounded like something sizing her up for dinner. The second day, she started crafting. The plasma knife could cut through the local wood, which had the density of iron and probably the attitude to match. She carved stakes, sharpened branches, fashioned a spear that was more hope than weapon. Her hands blistered. The gravity made every movement exhausting. But humans had this terrible habit of stubbornly refusing to die when the universe suggested they should. By day 3, she'd constructed a basic shelter, a platform suspended between 3 trees, accessible only by a rope she could pull up. Primitive, crude, but elevated enough that the things prowling below couldn't reach her without learning to fly, and if they learned to fly, she had bigger problems than shelter. Day 4 brought her first encounter with a Rix'claw. She was gathering water from a stream, filtering it through the suit's purification system, when the underbrush exploded with teeth and terrible intentions. The creature was exactly as advertised, 3 meters of predatory efficiency, scales that looked like they could deflect small arms fire, and eyes that calculated attack angles like a mathematician with a grudge. She dove left, rolled, came up running. The Rix'claw pursued with the casual confidence of something that had never failed to catch dinner. She made it to her tree, scrambled up the rope with gravity trying to drag her back down to the waiting jaws, and pulled the rope up just as claws raked the bark below. The Rix'claw circled, waited, eventually left, but not before marking the tree with some kind of scent gland that probably translated to "I'll be back for lunch." That night, she didn't sleep. She planned, because here's the thing about humans that the collective had failed to adequately note in their reports: humanity hadn't clawed its way to the top of Earth's food chain through superior strength or natural weapons. They'd done it through spite, ingenuity, and the deeply concerning ability to hold grudges across evolutionary timescales. Week 1 ended with her still alive, which apparently was noteworthy enough that the automated monitoring satellite pinged a surprised acknowledgement to the collective's Penal Oversight Committee. They noted it in the file and went back to their paperwork, assuming the inevitable was just delayed. Week 2 began with construction. She'd identified the Rix'claw patrol patterns, mapped the local water sources, and located a cave system that would work for long-term shelter if she could evict the current tenants. The plasma knife, operating on its last dregs of charge, helped her craft better tools, a hammer from dense wood and stone, a crude saw, and most importantly, weapon-grade stakes that could punch through Rix'claw scales if applied with sufficient velocity and desperation. She dug her first trap pit on day 9, a simple design, concealed with branches and leaves, placed along a game trail she'd observed the Rix'claw using. The next morning, she found one impaled on the stakes at the bottom, very dead and very available for resources. She used everything. The scales became armor plates for her shelter. The claws became knife blades. The meat, cooked thoroughly because she wasn't about to survive predators just to die from parasites, went into her food supply. The teeth she kept. Something about the expression on the tribunal's faces made her think interior decoration might become relevant. By week 3, she had 6 traps operational. The Rix'claw were learning, which was inconvenient, but she was learning faster. She began using bait, tactics, and what military strategists called area denial, but she thought of as making this territory too annoying to be worth it. Deadfalls, spike barriers, tripwires connected to swinging logs that wouldn't kill a Rix'claw, but would definitely ruin their afternoon. The local predators started avoiding her territory, not because they couldn't breach it, but because prey wasn't supposed to fight back with this level of tactical aggression. Prey ran. Prey hid. Prey didn't build trap networks that required pack members to sacrifice themselves just to get through the perimeter. Month 2 arrived with her establishing permanent residence in the cave system, now cleared of its previous occupants and significantly improved with amenities like a fire pit, smoke ventilation, food storage, and a workshop area where she experimented with local materials. She'd discovered that certain plants, when processed correctly, produced fibers strong enough for rope and fabric. Others had medicinal properties. One made a poison that could drop a Rix'claw in 30 seconds, which went immediately into her trap upgrade program. She started domestication experiments with the smaller creatures, rodent analogues, that were individually harmless but collectively could strip a carcass in minutes. They responded surprisingly well to food rewards and consistent non-threatening contact. Within 3 weeks, she had a colony living in a designated section of the cave, serving as both early warning system and garbage disposal. The satellite monitoring her survival started sending more frequent updates. The Oversight Committee began actually reading them. A human surviving 1 month on Kethara Prime wasn't just unusual, it was approaching statistically impossible. They filed the reports and waited for the inevitable correction to normalcy. Month 3 hit differently. She'd expanded her controlled territory to roughly 5 square kilometers, marked with boundary indicators that the local wildlife had learned meant turn around or become construction materials. She'd built a forge using clay from the riverbed and had progressed from Stone Age to early Iron Age technology. Her trap systems had evolved into overlapping networks of defensive perimeters that would make military engineers weep with professional appreciation. The Rix'claw had learned. They no longer patrolled near her territory. The few bold enough to try had contributed their remains to her growing infrastructure. She'd started breeding the rodent analogues selectively, developing a strain that was larger, calmer, and potentially useful for leather and food. Her garden, planted with seeds from edible local plants, was thriving in carefully maintained plots. She'd built a home, not a shelter, a home. The monitoring satellite's AI flagged the settlement for review. The Oversight Committee, upon seeing the imagery, called an emergency meeting. Then they called another one, because nobody believed the first one's conclusions. Then they dispatched a recovery team, early, because if a human had somehow survived 3 months on Kethara Prime, they needed to collect the body before something else went wrong. The recovery ship landed in the same clearing where she'd been dropped, which was vastly different from how they'd left it. The clearing was now cleared, properly, with marked paths leading into the forest. There were signs, actual signs, carved into wood, with arrows pointing towards something labeled home and away from something labeled probably don't. The recovery team consisted of 4 Class-XII security personnel, armored and armed with weapons designed to stop rampaging megafauna, and 1 Vren medical officer prepared to identify remains. They moved cautiously into the forest, following the path, weapons ready for the inevitable Rix'claw pack. What they found instead was a fortified compound. The perimeter was marked with a fence constructed from sharpened logs, interwoven with thorny vines, and studded with what appeared to be Rix'claw skulls. Lots of them, arranged in patterns that might have been decorative or might have been warnings, possibly both. Traps were visible once you knew to look for them, sophisticated designs that would impress military engineers. The compound interior contained multiple structures, a main dwelling built into the cave system, storage buildings, A workshop with what looked like a functional forge and garden plots arranged in neat rows. Smoke rose from a chimney. There was a water collection system, a primitive but effective defense tower, and in the center of it all, sitting on a chair made from Rix'claw bones and wearing armor cobbled together from scales, sat the human. She was sharpening a spear, one of many arranged in a nearby rack, and looked remarkably unconcerned about the armed recovery team staring at her. She looked up, smiled that unsettling human smile, and waved. "Hey, you guys are early. I wasn't expecting pickup for another couple years." The medical officer stepped forward, crystalline body refracting the afternoon light into confused patterns. "You're alive. Noticed that too, did you? Sharp. How?" She gestured around the compound. "Built stuff. Killed things that tried to kill me. Ate them. Repeat as needed." She stood, and the recovery team collectively took a step back. She'd gained muscle, lots of it, the kind that came from constant physical labor in high gravity. "Want a tour? I've got indoor plumbing." Sort of. One of the Class-XII security officers was staring at the skull fence. "These are all Rix'claw." "Yep. Took me a while to figure out the best way to handle them. Traps work great, but you've got to maintain them constantly. Honestly, they're not as tough as advertised once you understand their attack patterns. There are at least 40 skulls here. 43 actually, plus parts from another dozen I used for tools and armor." She stretched, joints popping. "They mostly leave me alone now. Learned behavior. I've got about 5 clicks of territory that they avoid entirely." The medical officer's lights flickered with distress. "You've claimed territory. You've established dominance over a Class-XII Death World ecosystem. Well, yeah. What else was I going to do? Die?" She laughed, that peculiar human sound that somehow conveyed both humor and threat. "Listen, I appreciate the pickup attempt, but I'm actually good here. I've got food, water, shelter, and nobody grabs my backside without permission." The recovery team exchanged glances, a complex cascade of non-verbal communication that essentially translated to "this is way above our pay grade." The lead Class-XII cleared his throat, a sound like grinding gears. "Ma'am, we're authorized to extract you back to civilized space. Your sentence has been commuted, given the circumstances." Circumstances being that I didn't die like you expected. That's one interpretation. She considered this, looking around her compound with obvious pride. "What if I want to stay? This is a penal colony, a death world. You cannot possibly want to remain here, can't I?" She walked to the edge of her perimeter, looking out over the forest that had tried very hard to kill her and failed. "I built this. Every trap, every wall, every improvement. Nobody told me I couldn't. Nobody gave me regulations or filing requirements. Just me, the wilderness, and mutual attempted murder until we reached an understanding." The Vren medical officer pulsed with concern. "You've gone native. I've gone practical. There's a difference." She turned back to them, and her expression was the particular kind of serious that made the security team tighten their grips on their weapons. "You people tried to kill me. Dressed it up fancy, called it exile, pretended it was justice. But you dropped me here, expecting me to die, probably within days, and you could all feel civilized about it. That wasn't, yes it was. Own it." She crossed her arms. "But here's the funny thing. I didn't die. I adapted, thrived even. And now you've got a problem, don't you? Because if word gets out that a human, one of your ranked 4.2 barely civilized species, can not only survive but dominate a Class-XII Death World, what does that say about your neat little hierarchy?" The silence stretched long enough to become awkward. The lead Calathi finally spoke. "Our orders are to extract you and file a full report. Your orders can take a long walk off a short cliff." She smiled again. "I'm staying. This is my territory. I claimed it, I built it, and I'm keeping it. You want to drag me out? You're welcome to try. But those Rix'claw out there, they learned not to mess with me. Quick study, really. Question is, are you smarter than a Rix'claw?" The Zenith Collective held an emergency session which hadn't happened in 4,000 cycles. The topic: what to do about a human who'd refused extraction from a Death World penal colony and had, according to all available evidence, established a functioning settlement that would make colonial pioneers jealous. The debate raged for 3 days. Some argued for forced extraction. Others pointed out that attempting to forcibly remove a human from territory they'd claimed might result in casualties, and how would that look? Some suggested leaving her there and pretending the whole thing never happened. That option was gaining traction until someone pointed out the monitoring satellite was still transmitting, and satellite data was public record. And oh dear, several news organizations had already picked up the story. Humanity's representative to the collective, when asked for input, had laughed for approximately 5 minutes straight before suggesting they might want to reconsider their civilization quotient rankings. In the end, the collective did what all massive bureaucracies do when faced with a problem they couldn't solve: they reclassified it. Kethara Prime was no longer a penal colony. It was now designated as an autonomous research outpost, with the human as its sole resident and administrator. They sent supplies quarterly, unmanned, and tried very hard not to think about what it meant that they'd attempted to execute someone for punching an ambassador, and she'd responded by conquering a death world. The human, for her part, accepted the supplies and continued expanding her territory. The Rix'claw gave her a wide berth. Her domestication program expanded to include larger species. She sent periodic reports to the collective, written in a tone that suggested she found the whole situation hilarious. And on her compound's main gate, carved in letters large enough to see from orbit, was a sign in perfect collective standard: civilization quotient, flexible upon request. The collective never did revise their rankings, but they did add a footnote to humanity's entry: prone to unexpected adaptability when sufficiently motivated. Caution advised. They should have led with that.